A long time ago, when I was in my mid-20s, I headed off to Europe with my girlfriend Denny. I'd never been outside America before, and Denny had only seen Mexico when she was little, so when we arrived in Bucharest, it was truly inspiring, despite the cold. Sadly, that magic wore off on the third or fourth day, when we got lost somewhere between Bersini and Brasov. The taxi driver spoke no English and must have thought we meant somewhere else, but we were basically left on a road in the middle of a forest. You could see the Carpathian mountains in the distance. I wasn't too worried at that point. I just kept telling Denny that we needed to keep walking. We had snacks and water and money. There was no doubt in my mind that we'd find a small town somewhere to spend the night, but as time passed, we saw nothing. I tried to call a few numbers on my phone, but technology was different then and I couldn't get hold of anyone. Even if I could have spoken to a taxi dispatch, what would I have told them? I didn't know where we were and they probably didn't speak English anyway. A few times, Denny cuddled into me and it felt good just to be warm. Still, I wasn't as worried as she was. After all, every road has to lead somewhere. The sun had just started to set when we heard a chugging noise coming from behind us. We turned around and saw an old red truck heading our way. I didn't have to even debate whether to stick my thumb up or not, as the truck stopped beside us. Inside was a guy who looked to be about 90 with a weather-beaten face and small stature. He rolled the window down and asked in broken English what we were doing. I said that we were lost and he kept shaking his head and repeating the words nearly dark, nearly dark. Eventually he beckoned us inside and we obliged. A silly move, some might say, but what was the alternative at that point? He seemed like a nice old guy and made some small talk along the way. In the back there was a mixture of logs and ready-cut timber. After 30 or 40 minutes, we turned off the road, down a dirt path. He saw the concerned expression on my face and said it was okay, his wife would cook for us. We pulled up at an old farmhouse. Lights were on inside and the front door opened as we got out the truck. An old lady with rosy cheeks came out and she shouted something at the man, then introduced herself as Elena and her husband who had driven us as Marcus. Her English was good and she kept trying to hurry us inside. As we walked up the stairs to the porch, Denny scraped her arm on a nail head and yelped. Elena gave her husband a serious look and we walked in the house. For the first time that day, I felt warm. Elena was boiling some water over the stove and asked how long we were walking for. I replied probably 6 or 7 hours and she said that we were lucky Marcus found us. I agreed and tried the tea that she handed me. She then poured some boiling water into a small metal bucket and dropped a brush into there, walked over to the front door and placed it down on the floor. On her way back in, she asked to see Denny's arm that she snagged outside on the nail. Denny rolled up her sleeve and Elena took something from under the sink to dress it with. She said you never can be too careful. I heard a scrubbing noise from the porch and asked what was going on. As she applied the bandage to Denny's arm, Elena said that Marcus was getting rid of any blood from outside. She said that especially in winter, certain species come in closer to the house, hungry and driven mad by the smell of blood. Denny looked over at me a few times and I tried to keep a straight face, but I could tell that Elena was sincere. Once he was finished, Marcus came into the warm and closed the heavy door that had a deadbolt attached to it. They then drew the thick curtains and seemed to relax somewhat, even supplying us with a glass of wine before we ate some kind of goulash. Once in a while, Marcus would stop and stare at the front door before carrying on talking. It was very odd, but he was in a cheerful mood anyway. They said that we could stay the night and drive us to the next town in the morning, which worked for us. Any concerns about them being serial killers was long gone. After a few hours they said it was time to go to sleep and we all began a trek up some creaky stairs. Elena showed us into the bedroom and quickly walked over to the windows, closing the same thick curtains that they had downstairs. She said that the bathroom was across the hall and we thanked her for her hospitality. It was then that we heard a thump from the window like something crashed into it. Elena shouted at Marcus, who rushed in the room with toothpaste round his mouth. They both stared, wide-eyed in the direction of the window and eventually broke off their gaze. Elena said, and I'll never forget this, that we were very far from home and things were different here. She said that we were safe in the house as long as we didn't open the curtains or respond if we were to hear anybody calling from outside. That night Denny and I held each other close and we heard the strangest noises from outside that window. Some were like a swooshing sound, and occasionally we heard a muffled kind of laughter. It all seemed very dreamlike, and I think we only drifted off to sleep when the noises stopped and a crack of sunlight peeked through the gap in the curtains at dawn. As tempting as it was, we didn't mention it to Elena or Marcus on our way into town, but when we eventually got back to the States, I did a lot of research on the area and discovered that it is rich in vampire history. I think staying overnight in that house actually saved our lives, and I dread to think what could have happened if Marcus hadn't picked us up on that road. A little under a year ago, a band called the Anarchies was playing near my hometown. Now I'm not a huge music fan, but the Anarchies got played a lot and they produced some of the best rock I'd heard. They were still a relatively new group and I jumped at the chance to see them live with a couple of my buddies. The drive was short, and as soon as we got through security, I went to the beer tent with Carl and Jake. It had been a while since we were all together, and although it was cold, I knew that we were in for a good night. The warm-up act was decent, some lady whose name I can't remember, but she sounded a lot like Amy Lee and performed some songs that she'd written herself. Carl was happy to be away from his girlfriend for the night, and Jake and I discussed what real music festival food was. The field was getting progressively busier and I naively volunteered to buy the next round of beers, and that's when things shifted. I managed to walk a few meters with a full glass in each hand and one in the crook of my arm when somebody knocked into me and all 3 glasses ended up on the floor. I was about to curse when I looked up and saw one of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen. She winced and said how sorry she was. I stood up and told her that it was okay, accidents happened, and she said that she'd replace the drinks. Ordinarily I'd have said not to worry as the beer was actually quite cheap, but I wanted to keep chatting to this girl, so we went to the back of the queue together and I did my best to charm her. She said that her name was Heidi and she was from the East, whatever that meant. Her English was a little off and her sense of humor was a little dark, I gathered from 1 or 2 jokes, but Heidi was very much my type. I could tell that in only the 10 minutes that I was with her. As we got near the front of the queue, she looked at the exposed area of my t-shirt and said that I should go and wash the beer off. I replied that I'd just wash it the next day, but she was very insistent, so I went, and we said to meet at the side of the beer tent afterwards. All of the porta-potty toilets were occupied, so I walked over a little bit and eventually found a park service center that was closed, but had a gents' toilet that I could use. I locked myself in one of the cubicles and began scrubbing my t-shirt. After a few minutes, there was what felt like a gust of wind blew through the toilets and I felt an odd feeling that I hadn't encountered before. There was a knocking at the toilet door, and before I could ask who it was, a soft voice asked if my t-shirt was clean yet. Of course, it could only have been Heidi, but how could she have known where I was? How did she get here so quick, and what about the drinks? Of course, all of that only occurred to me after I opened the door and saw her, but this time I got quite a shock. Heidi looked different. Her face was snarling, like a dog's, and she had blood on her. She was making a deep growling noise, and I didn't like it. I went to shut the door, but she anticipated my move and slammed it open with such force that the hinges broke and the door fell on the floor. I put a hand up to try and barge Heidi out the way, but she caught my wrist with a strong grip and her hand was ice cold. Just then, a loud Irish voice addressed Heidi and told her to let me go. She hissed and turned round to see 2 men in leather jackets, both with crucifixes, which they raised up. Heidi screamed. It was a hideous sound, and she backed against the wall. One of the men took a small bottle out of his jacket and told me to get down. He then sprayed Heidi, who roared like a lion, and began crawling up the wall, onto the ceiling. It was relentless and violent. They did not stop and kept reciting something over and over again in Latin. Heidi was covering her face and it looked like smoke or steam was coming from her body. She fell onto the floor and one of the men held her down, the other pulled out a steel stake and quickly stabbed it into her heart. She gasped and looked at me for a moment, her face returning to the Heidi I knew briefly before this. Then she turned into ash and her body crumbled. I slowly stood up, in complete shock and also disgust. One of the men said I could relax now and was safe. I asked what just happened, and he replied that Heidi was still relatively young in vampire years, trying to hone her killing skills, which needed a lot of work. He said that she'd probably had her eye on me for a few weeks, having maybe caught my scent when I was unaware, and she planned to drain me of blood tonight. I asked them who they were, and they replied that they were nobody, but warned me that Heidi was one of thousands in America alone. After that, they went out of the bathroom and I never left the house without holy water on me again.